Hi, so this is our ninth lecture of the deep learning course. And this one is about autoencoders and generative models. So we have seen so far classification and regression networks which take as input a large dimension signal and produce as output usually a quite small signal. In classification just a class, and in regression low dimension prediction. But in many applications, we need to go beyond that and to actually generate a high dimension signal. So the output of the network itself should be typically a sound or an image, so a very high dimension signal, of the same dimension as the ones we have used as input until now. So the typical applications would be image synthesis, denoising, super resolution, speech synthesis, compression, etc. Any application where you need in the end to generate a signal. And to do so, we need to have a way of modeling the data distribution. So instead of just placing, in the case of classification, finding boundaries between classes, in the case of regression of low dimension signal, just finding a proper direction or a proper gradient in the space of the data. Here we truly need to capture the very structure of the data. And this is usually done by characterizing meaningful degrees of freedom, which is what are the degrees of freedom which truly capture structure and are not simple noise. So a very simple example would be, imagine that I give you those points in 2D, in a 2D plan, and your task is to generate other similar points. Intuitively, you would capture this spiral structure and then generate a point near the spiral. You would, for the structure you would immediately intuitively grasp is that there is indeed a spiral structure of this form, which is very smooth, which can be described very easily. And then you have 1 degree of freedom to move along this spiral. And what you can do is just to generate you can first map your points, your original data points in this latent space, but what you can do is to sample over there and come back to your high dimension space. So doing so, you are able to regenerate data points similar to the ones you got in your training set, but different. So it's really the generative process. In that case, the mapping back, the mapping G coming from the latent, what's the so-called latent space. So we are going to use this term. So the original space and the latent space being the proper space of meaningful degrees of freedom. And in that case, when we come back from the latent space into the original space, there is no noise. So it's a deterministic mapping, hence we are strictly on the spiral, but we could easily make this, in that case, the model even more realistic by adding a little bit of Gaussian noise to move apart. So for image synthesis, for instance, the latent space could be, if you generate faces, could encompass both geometrical things, like the geometrical pose of the head in front of the camera, but it could also be the rays, render, hair color, haircut, etc. So if you want to generate a complex signal, this latent space can be very complicated and mix both continuous parameters and discrete parameters. So in practice, when we want to do this, with real-world signals, we have the same kind of challenges we have seen for predictions, which is we have to deal with a very high dimension signal, and we have to define a high class of high dimension models, and we have to, given that class, to optimize their parameters. And the interesting things that we saw in the previous course, when we saw that we can synthesize samples which make the network respond strongly, is that somehow, somewhere, there was a generative process, because we had a way of taking the network, in that case trained in a discriminative manner, and to do some optimization so that in the end we are able to regenerate an image. So this gives us a good reason to think that we can actually do this. We can, by using this kind of technologies, the networks, convolution layers, nonlinearities, gradient descent and such, we have good reason to believe that we can probably generate a realistic signal in some way. So the main piece of technology we have at our disposal to do so, we will see in the next lecture the generative adversarial networks, but in in the standard, in the historical way of generating high dimension signal, the standard tool was autoencoders. So what are autoencoders? So an autoencoder is composed of two mappings. One is a mapping from the original space to the latent space, so that we will call F in the remaining slides. And then you have a decoder that goes from the latent space to the original space, called G. So in practice, it looks like this. You have your original space, high dimension space, where you have good reason to believe that your data are living in a submanifold of low dimension. Your encoder that maps this original space into the latent space, where you will try to have as many degrees of freedom as necessary to describe the non-random part of the signal. And then you have the decoder that can take a point from the latent space and bring it back to the original space. So again, this could be a space of images, and this could be a space, for instance, of geometric parameters, or even more complicated stuff. Okay. A proper autoencoder has to capture a good parametrization of the signal, which means the F and the G will do a proper job, which means that F will capture the statistical dependencies between the signal components. So if you take a few pixels in an image, again, if you have a face in front of a camera, if you take 2 pixels in the image, they have a joint dependency with the latent variables, which is, for instance, the geometrical pose of the head. And if the mapping F is good, it will capture this and discover, in some sense, or encode that the complicated statistical relation between those 2 pixels is captured by a very small number of hidden parameters. So let Q be the data distribution over the original space. We can characterize a good autoencoder would be, for instance, characterized by the ability to reconstruct the original signal when you encode and decode with your two mappings. Okay, so which would mean if you average with data distribution Q, you pick a sample, you map it. So you pick a sample X, you map it into your latent space with F, you bring it back to the original space with G. If you are able to reconstruct on average something which is very similar to your original signal, then you're good. So you would like to minimize the expected L2 error between reconstructed signal, this guy, and the original signal, this guy. So now, what does it mean in terms of training? So if both F and G are parameterized models, so typically deep models, the training will consist of just looking for the parameters such that you minimize the average over all your training points of the reconstruction error. So you take each training point xn, you send it to the latent space with F, you bring it back with G, and you compare to your original thing. So a very simple case of autoencoder is to have both F and G linear, in which case the solution to this problem is PCA. The best you can do to minimize the L2 reconstruction error is to find to use an encoder that is going to project on the basis with maximum variance, and then to bring back optimally, which is with a linear mapping will give you PCA. Better results can be achieved with more sophisticated classes of mappings, and especially with deep architectures. So before we can describe a deep autoencoder, so this pair of an encoder which is going to look a lot like a standard network, but the decoder now has to have this specific property of going from a low dimension space to a high dimension space, so typically from a few tens of parameters upfront to the original signal to the original signal space properly. We need one more piece of technology that we have not seen yet, which are the transpose convolutions. So, as I said, we need the ability to increase the signal size, which is the opposite of what we have done so far with both convolutions, max pooling, and strided convolutions and dilated convolutions. Everything was oriented toward reducing the dimension of the signal, and now it's the opposite. But we saw in the last lecture that we can optimize the input signal with backprop to create an image. So if you remember, we had this dreaming kind of experiment where we put some Gaussian noise as the input, we select the output unit, and then we do gradient descent over the input to maximize the response of the unit. Which means that somehow, through the backpropagation, we have a way of propagating a low dimension signal, which is the class in the end, back to high dimension signal, which means that whatever happens during the backprop through the convolution layers, that's the trick. It's able to build a high dimension signal. And so there is a specific type of operations which are called transpose convolution layers, which allow to have this exact operation in a forward manner. So a transpose convolution layer basically implements what is the backward pass through a convolution layer. And I'm going to explain in detail in the coming slides what it means. To make it simple, let's consider first a 1D convolution operation. So let's call x the input vector to this 1D convolution, kappa the kernel, and y its output. So what we get is that the coefficient I of the vector y is going to be the coefficient I of this vector, the convolution between x and kappa. This is a convolution as in deep learning, which is, if you remember, there is this slight difference with convolution in signal processing because we visit the coefficients of the filter in increasing order, in the same order as the coefficients of the input vector. So if yi is the right coefficient of x called kappa, we get this expression, which is we visit the coefficients of filters in increasing order and multiply it, and basically the log product with this part of the input signal. We can change the variable, and if I introduce u such that a equal u minus I plus 1, I get this new expression, which is instead of u visiting the kappa is going to visit a fraction of the input vector. But in the end, we get this expression. And now if we look at the gradient with respect to the input to this operation, we get the following expression. Derivative is the coefficient u of the derivative of whatever quantity with respect to the coefficient u of the gradient with respect to x is the derivative of the quantity with respect to the coefficient u of the input, which is through the chain rule, because x u influence L only through sum of the yi. It's this expression. It's the sum of the derivative of the loss with respect to yi times derivative of yi with respect to xu, and this is exactly the kernel coefficient value. So in the end, what we get is that this coefficient of the gradient is actually an expression that looks awfully like a convolution itself. And indeed, if I call star this operation, which is the actual standard convolution from signal processing, what we get is that, in a concise manner, if y is a convolution in a deep learning sense, so with, again, the coefficients of the filter visited in increasing order. So if this is our standard convolution layer, if y equal x convol kappa in a standard deep learning sense, then the gradient with respect to the input to the layer is the gradient with respect to the output convolved in a standard sense with the filter. So that's quite interesting, and it can be seen as a fully connected layer as follows. If we apply a 1D convolution layer, it's exactly like applying, so with a filter of size 3, it's exactly like multiplying by a weight vector of this sort. So here we have an input signal of size 7, output signal of size 5, and a filter of size 3. And when you do a convolution by a filter of size 3, it's exactly this. It's really like the first coefficient is a dot product between your input vector and this vector with a bunch of zeros. And then you swipe a little bit your filter again and again and again. So that maybe if you did not realize this before, when you do a convolution by a 1D, when you do the convolution of a 1D vector with a filter of a certain size, it's exactly like multiplying by a fully connected layer with zeros on all lines except on consecutive coefficients of the size of the filter, and with the same stuff replicated on all the rows of your matrix. You have exactly the same sort of structure even if you do high dimension convolution, so convolution in 2D or 3D, except that it cannot be written so clearly as a matrix, but it's still the same stuff. You have basically a very sparse matrix with highly heavy weight sharing between the different rows and columns. And now, when we do the standard convolution, it's so the transpose convolution is exactly like multiplying by this guy. So it's hence the name. And if you remember that if you look at the fully connected layers, when we look at the backward pass-through fully connected layer, it boils down exactly to, instead of multiplying on the left by the weight matrix, we were multiplying on the right by the transpose of the weight matrix when we were processing a single sample. And it's exactly the same stuff. It's just to say that as soon as you see a convolution layer as a fully connected layer of the specific matrix, when you do the backward pass-through of convolution layer, it's exactly like doing the multiplying by the transpose of the matrix, weight matrix of the equivalent fully connected layer. Interestingly, on maybe to understand more intuitively what transpose convolution layer is, it's interesting to note that while a convolution can be seen as a series of inner products, so if you remember, you can really see a convolution layer as making a dot product between the filter and some vectors extracted from the input vector. You can really see a transpose convolution as a weighted sum of kernels. We illustrate this with a 1D convolution. So let's consider that we have an input vector of size 10 and a filter of size 4. We can see the convolution as I'm taking the dot product between the filter and this subvector extracted from the input. And then again, dot product between this guy and this guy, and dot product between this guy and this guy. And every time I do a dot product, I get a value that I store in the corresponding coefficient of the output vector. And in the end, because the filter has to fit in this swiping process, we lose a number of index equal to the filter size minus 1. Okay, so it's quite reasonable to see the convolution as an iterated dot product with the filter swiped through the input tensor. Now, similarly, let's consider a transpose convolution now. We have a 1D input vector of size 4 and a filter of size 3. And what we do is to take the product of the filter by each coefficient separately and to move the filter through the support of the input vector. And so we get that this vector is this coefficient times the filter, this vector is this coefficient times the filter, etc., etc. And what we get in the end, what is the output of the transpose convolution, is the sum of all those translated filters, translated and weighted filters, so which justify to see the transpose convolution layer not as an iterated product, but as a weighted sum of kernels, where the kernel is the filter itself. So PyTorch offers implementations of the transpose convolution, both as octograd functions and as modules. So here I'm illustrating the functional transpose 1D. So first we can see what we can do for standard convolution. So here I'm building a vector of n dimension on the size 7 coefficients, and filter of size 1 dimension and 3 coefficients. And when I do the convolution, I get as output size 7 minus 3 plus 1, which gives us 5, and we get this value. So more graphically, this is a standard convolution. If we take this input, which corresponds to this guy, convolved by this filter corresponding to this guy, this is the output we get. And if you remember, again, I tend maybe to insist a bit too much, but the convolution that we consider in deep learning visits filters in increasing order, which means that the pattern you get at the output is reverse with compared to the filter. If we now take the transpose convolution and we do something similar, so if we transpose the same input with the same filter, now not only we get the filter in proper order, because the transpose convolution visits the coefficient in decreasing order, the filter coefficient in decreasing order, but also while here we have reduced the support size because we went from 7 to 5 because the filter was of size 3, here we gain 2, so we go from 7 to 9. Okay? And of course, PyTorch offers modules that implement this and can be used in a deep learning architecture, in a deep model. So consider a variable with a similar input, and now we build this module transpose 1D. We set the bias to 0, and we copy explicitly 1, 2, minus 1 in the weight of the modules, and then we can we can do the convolution. There's nothing surprising here. It's simply implements the transpose convolution I described in the previous slides. So interestingly, transpose convolutions have also dilation parameters. They basically have all the parameters that standard convolution layers have, and it does ask for the convolution. So now, something that may be counterintuitive, that the stride and the padding parameter that the transpose convolution also have are defined in the output indexing support, not in the input indexing support. It's just to be consistent with the convolution layers. Okay, so just keep this in mind. The stride and the padding for transpose convolution layer are defined in the output tensor indexing. So for instance, if I have an input tensor of size 1D of size 4 on a kernel of size 3, sorry, and I do my transpose convolution with a stride of 2, this is what happens. I have this guy multiplied by this. So I have basically the same as with stride 1, but now instead of moving by 1 in the resulting tensor, I move by 2. So it's, when you know it, it's quite intuitive. You simply swipe faster in the response in the output layer, in the output tensor, which is quite consistent when you consider the duality between convolution and transpose convolutions. So the composition of a convolution and a transpose convolution of same parameters keep roughly the signal unchanged. However, and this may be sometimes tricky, when you do a convolution with a stride strictly greater than 1, you may not visit completely the input tensor. So for instance, you may lose up to a number of coefficients equal to the stride -1, simply because the filter will not fit. So the rule of to have an idea of the size that the transpose convolution will rebuild, it basically rebuilds, it generates a tensor of the size of the observed area, of the area that was observed by the corresponding convolution layer. So in practice, intuitively, you will reconstruct exactly, if you compose a convolution layer and a transpose convolution layer of same parameters, you will get back exactly the size of your original tensor, if and only if the input tensor originally has a size which is the filter size plus a number of times the stride. So in that case, it makes sense. If I have a stride of 2, I put my filter originally there, and there, and there, and there, and it's quite intuitive that to be able to have covered the full input tensor, so that we will rebuild the tensor of same size after the transpose convolution layer, we have to have that the input tensor was 1 time the stride, second time the stride, third time the stride, plus the filter size, so that we cover the full thing. A technical detail that appears in some of the papers about generative models is that using transpose convolution layers may generate some artifacts because all the pixels are not covered in the same way by the swiping filter. So for instance, if I generate a tensor of size 10 by using a transpose convolution layer with a filter of size 4x4 on the stride of 3. Here I illustrate with shade of grays how many times each pixel was covered by a filter. So those guys, the lightest one, have been covered only by 1 filter. The slightly darker ones 2 times, and the very dark ones 4 times, if I'm correct. And so it's quite natural that you will end up with some grid-like artifacts simply because all the pixels are not processed are not covered in the same way. So some people prefer not to use transpose convolution layers because they generate some undesirable artifact, and instead they use a standard analytic upscaling. So in PyTorch you have 2 of them, and actually upsample encompasses bilinear, but you have basically upsampling bilinear 2D, which is simply going to do a bilinear interpolation. So it just expands the tensor size and moves the coefficients, the values in the original tensor in the corresponding coefficients in the resulting tensor. So it simply expands the size of the tensor by putting more more indexes, by increasing simply the indexing. And then for the values, coefficients which are not covered by values from the original tensor, you do standard interpolation. So here we go from a tensor of of dimension a 2 by 2 tensor which contains the value 1, 2, 3, 4. If you do bilinear interpolation, you have the 1, 2, 3, 4 at the corner of the resulting tensor, and you have some interpolation in between. Another option is upsample that takes the value of the nearest coefficient in the original tensor. You just expand, and then you make clusters of coefficients which are the closest, and just copy the value. So in practice, when you use this kind of analytic upscaling, you may have undesirable side effects, so blurring, smoothing, or other stuff, and there is a clear weakness compared to transposed convolution layers, which is that when you do an analytic upscaling, there is no learning at all. So there is nowhere in the learning, there is no way of learning, adapting the upscaling to the specific data distribution. So the standard policy is to combine such an analytic upscaling, so bilinear or nearest neighbor, with followed by a convolution which is going maybe to fix locally the statistics of the signal. So in practice, if you have a conv transpose 2D of that sort in your model, you could replace it with either upsampling bilinear with a scale factor of 2, because here we have the stride of 2, followed by a convolution layer that is going to fix the tensor locally according to the data distribution, according to what the training tells it to do. Or you can use this upsample that takes the nearest coefficient. There are other versions of this that I haven't detailed. You can look at the documentation. This is one among, I think, 4 modes of upscaling. Okay. So now we have all the tools we need to build our first autoencoder, deep autoencoder. So everything we saw that we can build an autoencoder simply by minimizing the reconstruction error. So we have a loss. And now we also have layers to increase the signal size. So what we are going to have is we are going to run a simple test example on NIST, and what we are going to do is to have a bunch of standard layers exactly like the ones we have seen in the previous lecture. So convolution, ReLU, convolution, ReLU, convolution, ReLU. The only thing that now I'm playing a little bit with the stride instead of having max pooling, so I'm reducing the dimension with a stride greater than 1. And then, this is the new stuff, the decoder is going to have a bunch of transposed convolution layers which basically reflect as the dual of the convolution layer. So this one is going to upscale the signal in the dual manner as this one was reducing it. This one is going to compensate this one, etc. And so the stride on the kernel side and the stride parameters are identical. So this one copies this one, and the second one in the decoder copies last before one in the encoder, etc. So you can see that you have kind of a mirror structure. The only thing that the channels are in reverse order. So we go from 32 to 8 in the last layer. Now we go from 8 to 32. So if we look carefully at the size I've chosen, so NIST images are 28, 28. So my first convolution layer has a kernel of size 5 and stride of 1. So you can here each little black dot shows a location for my filter. So given that the stride is 1, I jump to every location. And since the filter is of size 5, I lose the 4 last in time of size. I go from 28 to 24. So I have 24 possible locations of my filter. So I get 24 coefficients. If I do the same, again, kernel 5, stride 1, I get 20. The next layer is size 4 on stride 2. So we go from 20 to 9, because if you move by 2 every time a filter of size 4, you can only put it at 9 locations, so you get 9 value. Then filter of size 3, stride 2, I have only 4 positions. And now what I do finally is I go from I have a kernel of size 4, which is the size of the input tensor, and I go from the number of channels I had there to 8. So what I will get in the end, since there is only one location, I put a filter. The filter in this last layer is of the same size as the signal I get. It can only be moved at one location. So what I get is a single 1 by 1 time 8, 1, 1 resulting final tensor. So I get a tensor which has 8 channels, because this is what I have here, but it cannot move around because I have a filter of the same size as the tensor I get there. So I get finally 8 times 1 times 1 tensor. So we went from 28, 28 to 8 times 1 times 1. And of course, by putting any value here, I can just choose the dimension of my latent space, because this is my encoder. Now, what does the decoder look like? And what does the decoder look like? It's exactly the same stuff in reverse. So transpose convolution layer, and then you just increase exactly the same stuff. You have you have 4 locations for the filter, so you get those 4 dots, and times 3 you get this guy, and you repeat and you repeat and you repeat, and we went from 811 to 128.28. So it's very simple. How do I train it? I just build my autoencoder. So let's maybe come back to the piece of code where it's written. So it's really defined like this, as inside these 2 networks that I'm going to apply one after another. And the training is done with mean square error loss, as I said before, which in that case plays the role of a reconstruction error. So I build my autoencoder. I state what is my embedding dimension. In the previous slide it was 8. How many channels I want as input. And then I simply build my criterion mean square error. I move everything on the GPU. I use Adam as an optimizer. And then I do my, I'm going to do several epochs. And for each epoch, I discard the target, the labels, because it's completely unsupervised. I just try to reconstruct the images. I use the train loader. I move my data to the GPU. I put it in a variable, move through the network, compute the error between the input and the output, and do my backward step. So the parameters of my encoder and decoder are going to be optimized to minimize the mean square error, so reconstruction error, which is in that case the mean square error. So now what do we get? What are the results? They are quite nice. So those are, in this slide, this is some of the original images taken in the test set, so they were not seen during training. This is the reconstruction after the encoding and decoding, and we go to a space of dimension 2. So there were only 2 dimensions kept after the encoder. In my previous slide I said 8, but here I'm showing a bunch of results with increasing dimensions, so I start with 2. And just as a reference, I also show what can you expect with PCA. Okay, PCA with 2 dimensions will give you this. So even this with only 2 dimensions, it's quite impressive, because it means that it was able to capture most of the time the right digit, which is the best way of encoding some stuff. But you can also see that as soon as something is very weird, you have troubles. So it was not able to capture that. If we increase the dimension, it gets better. If we increase the dimension, it gets better. If we increase the dimension, it gets better. And then, so here it's still nice. With 16 dimensions, it does far, far better than PCA. But you can see that when you have very bizarre things, like for instance this hole in the 0, this is not captured, it's reconstructed. And the hole there, it's not captured. This little thing is not captured. There's stuff like that. Which in one way is very satisfying, because it means that it's exactly doing what it's supposed to do. It captures the true structure, and what is noise on top of this structure is discarded, because it's the most efficient way of encoding stuff. If now I go to 32 dimensions, then it's even better, because it's able to reconstruct very finely even the little problems in the signal. PCA is doing a poor job, even if PCA is quite impressive for such a simple encoding algorithm. It's not doing as well by far as a deep encoder can do. So this gives us a very limited understanding of what's going on again. So what we can do to get a bit of intuition of the quality of the embedding, what we can do is to pick 2 points at random in the training set, in the test set actually, x and x prime, and then we map them to the latent space, so fx, fx prime. And then what we can do is to move across the line between them. So we just do linear interpolation in the latent space, okay, and then we reconstruct. So again, what I'm going to show now is we take 2 images from the test set, map them, and then move from one to another by simply doing linear interpolation in the latent space. So really like a weighting with alpha between 0 and 1 between going from fully the mapping the latent representation of the first to fully the latent representation of the other linearly. And what we get is this sort of result. So here it's with 8 dimensions. If I pick 2 number 7s, we get a very, very nice and smooth interpolation. If you go from 0s to 4, it's not as good, but it's not as realistic. But what does it mean to be realistic? It really looks like if somebody has drawn something. Same for 7 to 1 and 2 to 7. If we go to dimension 32, it's the same kind of stuff. We go from a 6 to a 4, and we see that we have a sort of a deformation that really look like a deformation of the drawing itself. I have not plotted this, maybe I should have, but if you are doing the same with PCA, you would just get a blurring. You would just go, it would exactly be like doing the linear interpolation at the pixel intensity level. So you would just go for each pixel independently would go linearly from this value in one image to this value in the other one, going through different shades of gray. Now, if we want to assess the generative capabilities of this model, it's not so simple, but what we can do is we can map all the training data into the latent space, fit a Gaussian over there, so make the kind of very optimistic assumption that because some miracle happened, maybe the distribution of the data after they have been embedded in the latent space is Gaussian. So we fit a Gaussian there, and now what we can do is to sample according to this Gaussian and bring back the signal into the original space. So it would consist of this. We have the original space. We map all the training points in the latent space. We fit a Gaussian there. We can sample a bunch of points according to the Gaussian and map there back, and we will get something in the original space. So it's not so nice. So if we do this with dimension 8, this is the sort of stuff we get. 16 we get this, and 32 we get that. So it's not, it does not solve, it definitely does not solve the sampling problem. We are not able to synthesize stuff. We saw that it's really nice at catching the meaningful degrees of freedom, because even with a small number of dimensions, we are able to reconstruct very well the input signal, but it's not so great for synthesis. And of course, these results are satisfying because the density model we have used on the latent space is too simple and inadequate. So I said, okay, I'm going to fit a Gaussian. There is no reason that the data points after embedding, after being sent to the latent space would be Gaussian. And in fact, now you could say, okay, I'm going to do something more sophisticated than a Gaussian, but then it's a bit of chicken and problem. We go back to the same problem. You want to fit, to model a complicated density in a high dimension space. Even though now the dimension is lower, so maybe it's simpler. But even this is strongly disputable, because it's perfectly possible that the data in the high dimension space, even if the dimension was higher, were less entangled than they are in the latent space. So the latent space actually makes a better use of the degrees of freedom. It captures the structure of the data, but maybe for some poor reasons, you have the distribution is very hard to model in the latent space. And basically, what we are going to see now is well, a huge part of what we do in this lecture is about fixing this problem. So how can we explicitly build a model so that we can now sample properly according to a good model of the density of the data in the original space. So quite famous variants around autoencoders are the denoising autoencoders proposed by Vincent et al. In 2010 from Yoshua Beijo's group. What the views they have on the autoencoder is as a way of maintaining mutual information between the input and the embedded signal. So if we call X sample, random variable standing for sample, Z is embedding the latent representation of X, and I will also call Q theta of XZ the expression of XZ. It's X by theta because the embedding depends on a bunch of parameters. What we can say is it's quite reasonable to say, oh, I'm going to optimize my theta to maintain the information content between X and Z. So really, mutual information between those two variables. And as we know, the mutual information can be expressed like this. This term does not depend, the entropy of X does not depend on theta, so finding the theta that maximizes the mutual information between X and Z is the theta that minimizes the entropy of X given Z, which again makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of information about X contained in Z if knowing Z make X as deterministic as possible. If the entropy was 0, there would be a full, complete information in Z about X. So sometimes this may look a bit abstract and sophisticated, but it's quite concrete. It's really this quantity X given Z is really the distribution of X when you know Z. So typically, if we go back to the example of the MNIST example, would be if you consider the case with the 16 dimensions, I give you the Z, so you're able to reconstruct your character, your digit 0, for instance, which is X. But what remains is a bit of randomness that indeed there can be a bit of noise, there can be some part missing, but this randomness is very limited compared to the overall randomness of the X before conditioning. So you can really see this as how much noise remains about X when Z is known, how much fixing you would need to really make it, to reconstruct X fully, when you have already reconstructed from what was contained in Z. And so now the entropy of X given Z is expectation under XZ of the log of the posterior of the conditional distribution of X given Z. And so this is what we would like to optimize. Unfortunately, the main problem in this, and it's really a fundamental problem, is that estimating Q theta of X given Z is very, very complicated. It basically amounts to an optimization for an inverse problem. If you give me X, I can very easily compute Z because I have a forward way of computing this. But given this forward way, the reverse is very, very complicated. It's basically solving an equation that may have multiple solutions, and it's very hard. So here comes the trick, which is fundamental in all the sophisticated deep learning methods, whether they are autoencoders or generative adversarial networks or stuff like that. The idea is that we are going to use another architecture to do this inverse mapping. So this idea to use another model to do the reverse mapping is justified by first this inequality, which is that if X and Z follows the distribution Q theta, so I have not added in the expectation that it's all the expectations are under Q theta. And we have this quite standard result, which is that the expectation under Q theta of log of Q theta of X given Z is greater than the expectation under Q theta of log of any other distribution of X given Z, which basically just states that this Q theta is a distribution that makes the log likelihood highest for because it's a true distribution. So given that this inequality holds, it's reasonable to say, okay, now I'm going to approximate this stuff that I cannot compute so by using another distribution that I'm going to optimize. So now in what follows, P is actually P eta, so it's a model parameterized by parameter eta. And we make the assumption that we model this distribution, this posterior, as P eta of X given Z equals Z is simply a Gaussian distribution centered around a deterministic function of Z and of fixed sigma. So we just substitute to the true conditional distribution a parametric model, which is a Gaussian noise around a deterministic mapping, which itself is a deep model. So now what we get is that what we want to maximize is the expectation of log of P theta of X given Z, which is, given that this is a Gaussian, it's simply the expectation of the L2 minus the expectation of the L2 norm square between X and the reconstruction, because G of Z is G of f of X. And so in the end, if we believe that by optimizing eta, we actually approximate properly log of P theta of X given Z with this expression, Q theta, sorry, then it makes sense that what we want to minimize eventually to maximize the information content is to find the theta such that the minimum over eta of the mean square error with a decoder which plays the role of the conditional distribution of X given Z is minimal. So all this makes a lot of sense. In the end, we come back to a reconstruction error, but now justified from an information theoretic perspective. Minimizing the construction error amounts to maximizing the information content between the original signal and the embedded one. And this abstract view of the encoder, which we see as a maximizing information mapping, justifies to use it to build a generic encoding layer. So it makes sense to say then that we could, in some sense, build the layers of an architecture with such a criterion, which has the advantage of being unsupervised, as a way of building good layers before making a label-based decision. So, in the perspective of building a good feature representation, just retaining information not enough. Otherwise, it would be a good choice. We would just rely on reducing dimension to do something. So that's a way you could reduce the dimension of your code for sparsity. It's a way of pushing the model to maximize retained information in constrained coding space. What they propose in their work, what Vincent and Al propose in their work, is to degrade the signal with noise before feeding it to the encoder, but to keep the mean square error to the original signal. So in some sense, they want to build an encoder that retains a meaningful structure because the noisy ones have been discarded, are hidden by the noise they add in the signal they use to encode. And so now they compare what happens if they use either a weight decay type regularizer or their trick of building the encoder with Gaussian noise. And what we see is very nice, is that the structure that emerges in their autoencoder when they use this noise trick to force some regularization are far nicer, actually pieces of edges. So again, this is on NIST. This gives on natural images. This builds very nice edge-like and piece-like structure, while this is more the usual PCA-like, wavelet-like, Fourier-like basis. They also compare different type of noise, and if they use a salt and pepper noise, they obtain more like filter on the left, and with a noise where they mask piece of the image, they obtain a different type of filters. So on top of this, what they propose, so they have this notion that they build this autoencoder. So the first idea is to see it as maximizing information. The second one is to put noise to force the autoencoder to have to retain the meaningful information, and then they use it as now all this framework justifies. It can be used as an initialization of layers. So they do that. They build an autoencoder, getting the input signal and reconstructing it. They train it, and then they keep only the encoding part and build a new autoencoder that also recode even more the signal, discard the decoder, do it again, discard the decoder, and in the end they add a final decision layer built on this representation. And they can fine-tune either all the structure or just train the last layer. And what they show is basically they compare to on multiple data sets this strategy with different ways of either of building of pre-training layers, and they see that this stack denoising autoencoder works very well across the data sets. So this was part of the one of the reasons that deep learning at some point was getting popular again. That those kind of techniques seemed like a reasonable way of initializing very deep structures and avoiding the problem of local minimum, because you would have a sort of a generic structure able to extract meaningful information and that you can train in a forward manner. So you train one layer at a time, which seems to be a good way of being shielded from vanishing gradient and other issues. More modern techniques that we have seen in other courses like Bachelor and others have made those auto-encoding initialization a bit less attractive, but they are still in the air. So it's something that we see from time to time, and that may be getting popular again at some point. Come back now to the actual generative problem. So how can we generate signals which are actually realistic, that follow the true distribution of the data? So what we saw is that if we do something naive, which is to build an autoencoder and then to fit a Gaussian over the latent space, over the data points mapped into the latent space, and then generate sample according to the Gaussian and come back to the original space, we get some samples which are unrealistic, which truly are not similar to the ones from the true population. And why is that? Simply because there is no reason in this scheme that the distribution in the latent space actually follows the normal distribution. So when we build the encoder, we just built it so that combined with the decoder, we are able to rebuild the signal. It's just maintain, seen from the prism of the autoencoder, of the denoising autoencoder, it just maintain information. But there is nothing in this description that says, okay, I want the distribution in the latent space to follow a normal distribution. So this motivates a new type of methods where we actually add to the reconstruction loss an additional term that specifically pushes the distribution of the data when they are mapped in the latent space to follow a normal distribution. If we achieve this, so if we are able to build an encoder and a decoder such that when we map the original data to the latent space, they follow Gaussian distribution, they follow normal distribution, and when we map them back, we are able to reconstruct exactly the training data. We are in good shape, because now it means that if we sample according to a normal distribution in the latent space and map back the sample we have, the point we have sampled to the original space, we will get something that follows the true distribution of the data. So this is the motivation behind the variational autoencoder. So in what follows, I'm going to use two distribution, joint distribution over original space on the latent space. The first is Q. So Q is distribution we obtain if we cut randomly uniformly the data point and we map it to the latent space with the encoder. And P is the inverse. It's the joint distribution over X and Z we obtain if we first sample Z according to a normal distribution, and then we map back with the decoder into the original space. So ideally, what we would like is that we would like to build a P, so a decoder, such that the density P is such that when we sum the log of the probability of the training points, it's maximized. So this would be a purely likelihood maximization scheme where we simply optimize P to make this maximal, to make the training data the most likely. The problem with this nice way of thinking is that it's quite easy to sample Z and compute G of Z, so to come back, but it's quite hard to compute P of X for a given X, and even less to compute its derivative. So it's very difficult if I give you a point X in original space to compute what was the probability to actually reach this. If we were sampling a normal according to the normal density in the latent space and coming back with G, to compute under this sampling model the probability to reach a certain X, it's quite difficult. And it basically, again, amounts to solving a very complicated inverse problem. The variational autoencoder proposed by Kingma and Welling in 2013 relies on a tractable approximation of this log likelihood. So their framework considers a stochastic encoder and decoder whose outputs depend on their inputs as usual, but also with some remaining randomness. So what we want to maximize is expectation of log of Px. We can also say we want at the same time we have a second model that we call Q, and we want now to maximize this, since those are the expectation of the difference of the expectation. If we maximize this in P and Q, we get the maximum for P alone. Now we can rewrite this like that. We just introduce those terms, the pairs, and we can rewrite this. And in the end, what we get is this expression. So actually, the thing we want to maximize, maximizing the log, the expectation under the true distribution of the log of P of X, amounts to minimizing the divergence of the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the joint, the distribution that we obtain if we sample an X and map to Z, and the distribution we obtain if we sample a Z and map to X, so the Kullback-Leibler between those two distributions, plus a term which is positive. So this we cannot compute, but what we are going to do is we are going to use this lower bound as our objective. So now, instead of maximizing this thing, we are going to minimize this thing. And it actually makes sense. What you want to do, it's true that it's a bit more than what we truly need. What we need is simply that if I sample according to a Gaussian and decode, I get something which looks like the real stuff. And here we do a bit more. We want that if we take a real sample, map it to Z, and then or sample Z and come back to X, those two distribution over pairs of X and Z are similar, which is a bit more than what we need, because there is no reason whatsoever that the Z we get when we encode is similar to the Z we need when we decode. This is a constraint we add. This is related to being able to use another model to do the reverse mapping. And this approximation is quite reasonable and works very well in practice. So now we can write this like that. We have two terms. One is the expectation of the divergence between the conditional distribution of Z given X and the prior over Z. So this is the distribution, the normal density, because this is how we sample Z when we in the synthesis process. And this is the true distribution of Z given X. So here we are, these are two terms we control. So this is, if you take an X, you map it to the latent space, what is the distribution of the mapping. And this is the prior we want to impose over Z in the latent space when in the synthesis process. And this also is quite reasonable, is the log of P of X given Z. So this is the distribution of an X when we sample a Z in the latent space and come back with the decoder. So all those terms, this term we have is quite, no sorry, yes, this term is quite complicated. This is the type of things we cannot do anything with. But those three terms are quite reasonable. So again, this is a distribution in the latent space when you start from a true point. So this we know. We just map it with our encoder and we know where we arrive. This is the probability that we want to impose in the latent space. And this is the probability in the original space when we take a point at random in the latent and map it back with the decoder. Okay, so this we can compute with the encoder, this we can compute with the decoder, and this is the prior we want to impose. So in our working on Welling, you Gaussian with diagonal covariance for both Q of Z given X and P of X given Z. So in practice, the encoder maps the data point from the signal space, the input space to the latent. It simply maps to the mean and the variances. So given that the covariance matrix is diagonal, you just need to compute the diagonal. And G does the other way. So it goes from the latent space to the original space, but you have twice the dimension because you have the mu and the sigma. So in practice, what it means is that we want, at the same time that the two terms in the loss we want to minimize. The first is that if we take a point at random in the data set and map it to the latent space, the posterior on Z we get is close in the Kullback-Leibler divergent sense to the normal distribution. And if now we sample Z according to this distribution and go back and come back to the original space, the original X we sample is likely under the posterior over X we get given the Z on the mapping back. So in practice, we have to minimize those two terms. This one, the first one, given that we have an analytic expression or a Gaussian distribution for both Q of Z given X, because this is the decoder that takes, this is the encoder, sorry, that takes an X and map it to in practice to the parameter of a Gaussian. And since P of Z is a normal density, we can compute analytically the KL divergence between the two. Again, this is a Gaussian whose parameters are given by the encoder. This is a Gaussian whose parameters are fixed. It's a normal, centered normal Gaussian. So we have this closed form expression. And for the second term, this we do not have an analytic form, but we can do it by sampling. So we have sample, we can sample a Z according to the posterior over the latent space, and then we can compute, we can sample a bunch of them and compute a descent approximation, a numerical approximation of this guy by just computing the average of the log of the Gaussian for those parameters. What Kingma and Welling states is that you don't need to sample a lot, a single one is enough. So in the optimization scheme, for every X we map to the latent space, we sample a single Z that we map back to the original space. So we can now implement this in PyTorch. So we start from our autoencoder from NIST, and we are going to change two things. The first is that now the encoder will map to twice the number of dimensions, since we need to not to produce a Z, but a distribution over Z. So the first half of the output will be seen as the mean, will be interpreted as the mean of the Gaussian, and the second half of the output will be seen as the variance of this Gaussian. And we also have to change the loss to now incorporate the penalty term due to the KL between the posterior over Z given X and the normal density over the latent space. So in practice, what it means that we interpret the result of the encoder as the parameter vector, the first half being the mu, the second half being the log of the variance. So we use the split function to split one tensor into two. Then I had to do this. So there are two things I'm not very happy with here. Well, first, I had to divide the variance by 100 to make all this converge. And the second stuff was that I had to weight the KL with 1/2. But so what we do is to have here we have the vector of the logarithm of the variance. We compute from this the vector of the standard deviation for the Gaussian of over Z. Now we can compute the KL between the resulting Gaussian and the normal density we want to have in the latent space. And now what we do is that we sample one vector Z according to this distribution by sampling another normal vector to multiply by the standard deviation on which we add mu. So when we are here, this Z has been sampled according to the posterior over X given Z, given the Z that we get from mapping original X. And now, in the end, we decode this guy to get an X in the original space. On the final loss, incorporate both first mean square error between the original image and the constructed one by mapping to the latent and coming back. And the second is the KL between the posterior over Z given X and the normal densities. Yeah, maybe one detail I should have said is that here we consider that the variance for the decoder is fixed. So the decoder is we don't have the trick that in the decoder we have the first half being the mu, the second half being the sigma. We just have the mu's and this directly appear here. We should have in front this sigma common to all the dimension that is probably now hidden in this coefficient there. Okay. And so we can look at, we can try this model now. So this is the original data set. This is the autoencoder reconstruction, not the variational one, the original autoencoder with 32 dimensions. And it is a reconstruction if we optimize the autoencoder loss. So we see that as expected, it's not as good because now we have forced distribution over the latent space to be normal. So it was one more constraint over the loss that penalize a little bit the MSE, the reconstruction loss. But however, we get a far better reconstruction. So if we sample, if we do the same trick as we did before, we fit a Gaussian in the latent space, sample according to it and come back, we see that with the original autoencoder we get some quite unrealistic samples, while if we sample according to the decoder that we play in the variational autoencoder, we get some far more realistic samples that look more like the sample from the real density. Okay. Another technique to model a complex density over a high dimension space is the non-volume preserving network, which itself is an example of a larger class of methods called the self-normalizing flows. So those techniques starts from this quite standard result from probability theory, which is that if you have a density over a space, a variable Z, and P of Z is the density of this variable, and then if you apply an invertible mapping f-1 to Z, then the probability you get on X by transforming the distribution of Z through this invert mapping can be computed as follows. So the probability that f-1z reaches X is probability that f of X, that Z reaches f of X times the Jacobian of f at X. So we can illustrate this with this example. So if Z was uniform between 1 and 3, and we apply the invert of this mapping f, what we get is the following distribution, which makes sense. So where the mapping is the identity, you keep the distribution unchanged. If the mapping has a small Jacobian, so the slope is small, then it tends to dilate the distribution and put the same amount of mass over a larger domain, so the density goes down. And then if you go back to a slope of 1, you go back to the original density, which means that the probability to reach, for instance, this point, you have to go back through f to what was the probability to reach Z in the original space, the Z that brings you there, and you pay in the price of the Jacobian when you go through f, because when f dilates the space somewhere, the density is reduced consistently. So now, which means that if we are able to compute and differentiate both the original density of Z for a certain point f, and we can compute and differentiate the Jacobian of f at any point. Then what we can do is to make f1, the distribution of f minus 1 of z, fit the data by optimizing the sum over the sample of the log of the probability of f minus 1z over xn. So this is the probability that f minus 1z reaches the point xn, and we sum the log of those quantities over all the training points. And using the result we saw in the previous slide, this is equivalent to maximizing sum over all the sample of the log of the probability that your mapping, not the invert but the direct mapping, the probability of z at the point of the mapping where xn is mapped, times the Jacobian of f at xn. And if we're able to do so, so if we can optimize f such that this is large, then we are good, because it means that now we can synthesize a new x by first synthesizing new z according to the density we decide. So for instance, we can fix this guy, and then we do the reverse mapping and we get an x. So now, if z follows a normal density, the first term is very easy to compute, because the log of p of z of f of xn is simply minus 1/2 of the L2 norm square plus the normalization factor of the normal density, which takes into account the dimension of space. So the first term is very easy to compute and differentiate. We just have to compute the forward mapping and we're good. But then the Jacobian is another story. So the Jacobian, if we consider a composition of mappings, we saw this result that the Jacobian of a composition of mapping is basically the product of the Jacobian. So the second term, which is the log of the determinant of the Jacobian of f at x, is actually the sum of the log of the Jacobian of f1 at x plus the log of the Jacobian of f2 at f1 of x plus the log of the Jacobian of f3 at f2 compose f1 of x, etc. So this is computable, but maybe quite expensive. But now, if we have both, we can optimize f so that f minus 1 of z match the data. And what the missing piece is that to be able to sample data, we have to be able to compute f minus 1 of z, which means that we need invertible fx's. So we have two problems now, that with standard layers, the Jacobian is very expensive to compute, and we cannot really invert a layer. So the layers we have seen so far, the convolution or whatever, we do not have a way of reverting the layers. For some of them it may be possible, so typically a fully connected layer, if the weight matrix is not degenerated, we can just invert it, but for ReLU we cannot, and for many other transformations where the dimension is reduced, we cannot, etc. So what was proposed by Dean et al. In 2014 is a new type of layers called the coupling layers, which basically address both issues. And what they do is that they build a bunch, they combine a bunch of those layers to build the so-called non-volume preserving network, which will allow you to summarize two important things. First, you will be able to go forward and to compute the invert of any mapping. So you can go from x to z, but also from z to x. And also you can compute the Jacobian for chip. So we are going to see in the next slides how this is possible. So we are going to use the formalism from their 2016 paper. And given the dimension of the signal d, we'll call b a Boolean vector of d dimension. And we will have two mappings, both from rd to rd, s and t. On the coupling layers, so those guys can be complicated network. And they do not have to have any properties. They don't have to be invertible or whatever. They just have to be differentiable. So these can be arbitrarily mappings. But now what the coupling layer does, this is in the fully connected case, and there is a convolutional case. What it does is that it's going to map x to, first you take the component-wise product with b. So basically, the image of x is composed of b component-wise x plus 1 minus b component-wise something, which means that we already see that the component for which b is equal to 1 are kept unchanged. They are forwarded through the layer unchanged. And for the one which are modified, they are modified according to a function that depends on the non-modified component. So again, the component of x's which correspond to ones in B are forwarded unchanged through the layer. On the component of X, which correspond to the zeros of B, what do? We add a value to each of them, which can be arbitrary, and we multiply each of them by the exponential of an arbitrary thing. Component-wise again, this is component-wise, and this sum is done component-wise. So we can try to illustrate this that way. So imagine for simplicity, I put all the b is equal to 1, I put one half where the b is equal to 1, and the other half where the b is equal to 0. So all those coordinates of x are kept unchanged. In C of x, which is the image of x through the layer, I keep them unchanged. This is this term. And all the other ones, what I do is that I compute an s that I send through an exponential and I multiply component-wise, and I compute a t and I add it and I result in this. Which means that why do we have this very weird computation? It's simply that now we can invert it. So as a matter of fact, if y equals c of x, just by taking b component-wise y, we get back all those coordinates from x because we knew that these ones were kept unchanged. So if this is y, c of x, just multiplying by b, I get back the proper coordinate from x. And now, given that I have this, I can compute t, and I can subtract it, and I can compute s, and I can divide component-wise by exponential of s. I can or multiply by exponential minus s. Which means that this operation does the invert of the coupling layer. Maybe it needs a bit of thinking, but the important stuff is that, in a nutshell, some of the components of x are kept unchanged, and the other ones are modified with a function that depends on the unchanged one, and modified in a way which is invertible. So you can go in both directions. And the second very nice property of this layer is that the Jacobian is very simple. So the first thing is that for the coordinates which are not changed, the Jacobian is equal to 1 because they are unchanged. And for the ones for which it's 0, they are influenced only by the coordinate for which the b's are equal to 1. So you do not have a coordinate for which b is equal to 0 that influences another coordinate, another component for which b is equal to 0. So it's a bit hairy formulation, but in the end what we get is as follows. That if we compute the Jacobian and we put first the coordinate for which b is equal to 1 and then the coordinate for which b is equal to 0, the Jacobian has this form, which is the x's are kept unchanged, you have the identity matrix. The x's for which b equals 0 do not influence the x's for which b equals 1, so this upper quarter is equal to 0. This part is diagonal because there is no interaction between the x's for which b equal to 1, and you may have interaction for which of x's for which b is equal to 1 to the x's for which b is equal to 0, but it kept the matrix lower diagonal with zeros over there, which means that the determinant of this guy is actually the product, the determinant of the determinant of this guy is actually the sum of the log of the term of the diagonal. Those people dies, and here we take the log of the exponential, so it's just the sum of the s mapping over the b's for which over the x's for which b equal 0. So in the end, we have a very nice closed form, which is the log of the Jacobian of such a layer at x is simply the sum over all the coordinates of 1 minus b, so we just take the ones for which b is equal to 0, of s of the coordinate s on this guy. So we can check numerically this property of the Jacobian. So here it's a little piece of PyTorch to do so. So I first define the number of dimensions of my space, so it's 6. I create a batch of a single sample dimension dim full of normal noise. I'm going to need the gradient for this guy. I'm defining the binary mask with as many dimensions. I fill it with zeros and then I fill the first half with ones. So this binary mask would be 1/2 of ones, 1/2 of zeros. Then I define my two mappings that go from dim to dim. So here it's simply a linear layer followed by a hyperbolic tangent, both of them. And then so they are going to be initialized as always in PyTorch randomly when we create them. And then I actually compute my image through the corresponding coupling layer. So it's simply b component-wise product x plus 1 minus b component-wise e component-wise exponential of s and plus the t. And then what we can do is this fancy line of Python is going to compute the Jacobian for us. So it's visiting the coefficients of c one by one, and then compute the gradient of this component with respect to x each time, and then concatenate the lines into a resulting array. And so if we do this, we are plenty happy because we get, as expected, a 6 by 6 array. The top left quarter is filled with an identity matrix corresponding to these guys, the coordinates which are kept unchanged. The top right quarter is zeros because the coordinate for which b is equal to 0 do not influence the coordinate for which b is equal to 1. This guy is diagonal corresponding to this component-wise product. This component-wise product. And these guys are complicated because it's how the x's for b is equal to 1 are influencing indirectly the x's for which b equals 0 through the s and the t's. Through the s, sorry. So we have the numerical evidence of the previous slide, and that's quite nice to see once more that PyTorch allows to write compact piece of code that do marvels. So now if we recapitulate what we have so far, so we have k coupling layers, f1 to fk. We have a f, which is a composition of all those layers. And if we call xn of 0 the input vector and xn of k the response after layer k, the loss in the end is the sum over the training points of the log of the probability of the resulting mapping, which is overall f image of xn through the overall f, which is the output of the final layer, square plus the normalizing term of Gaussian density, plus the sum across the layers of the log of the determinant of the Jacobian of each layer, which is finally, this is also the log of the determinant of the product of the Jacobian, which is the log of the product of the Jacobian of the overall mapping. And as we described in the previous slide, the log of the determinant of the Jacobian of a single layer is simply the sum of the s's of the coordinates which are actually modified. And now if we optimize, if we train an F to minimize this loss and we obtain one that works, then to sample data, what we just have to do is to sample a Z according to a normal distribution, and then compute its invert image through F. We can now implement a coupling layer as follows. So it's a module, it's a subclass of module. It gets, its constructor gets as parameters the two mappings, S and T, on the binary mask. We keep a copy of a reference to the mappings and a copy of the binary mask that we put in a variable. It's not a parameter because we will not optimize it. The forward method is a bit more complicated than usual because here what I do is that at the same time I compute the image through the layer and I also accumulate the logarithm of the determinant of the Jacobian. So I expect it's actually my forward method is going to compute this. It gets an x and a u, and it a pair x and u, and it computes a pair f of x, which is the image of x through the layer, and it also adds into u the determinant of the Jacobian of f at x. So this will it will be convenient because then we will push the samples through the layers one after another, and in the end we will get both the image of x through the full composition of layers that we will use to compute the log of the probability under the normal density, and we also get the accumulation of the log of the determinant of the Jacobian, which will result into the log of the determinant of the Jacobian of the full mapping. This is what we need to compute the loss. So to implement this, it's quite easy. I first decompose the pair into its two components, the x and the current sum of the log of the determinant of the Jacobian. Then I compute the values of my two mappings S and T. Then I update my sum of the log of the determinant of the Jacobian with the formula we saw in the previous slide, which is 1 minus b times s. We sum the s's for which b is equal to 0. And then we compute the image through the layer, which is, again, as the formulas in the previous slides, b times x component-wise plus 1 minus b component-wise exponential of s times x component-wise plus t. And we return both. And the invert mapping is, again, very simple, exactly what we saw in the previous slide. We compute the value of S and value of T, and then we first subtract T, so it's y minus T, component-wise exponential minus S, so this compensates for S, and again, B component-wise y is are kept unchanged, and 1 minus B are compensated, are revert. Okay, so now using this layer, we can easily build a full network. So again, it's a subclass of module. What it gets as input is simply the constructor just gets a number of dimension, number of hidden dimension, and how many layers. What I do is that I create a tensor for the binary mask equal to the dimension of the space. I create a module list to store my layers, and what I do here is that every even layers I initialize my tensor, my binary mask with half zeros, half ones, and on every odd layers I just invert the bits, which means that we alternate layers that one will keep some component unchanged, the next one will change those ones and keep the other one unchanged, and then we randomize. We create the mappings for each layer as one hidden layer perceptrons with a certain number of hidden dimensions. And then we append the coupling layer into layer list. Okay, the forward pass is very simple. We just go through the list of layers and apply them one another. And the invert is also quite simple. We go through the layers in reversed order and call the invert method. What is missing for the training is the loss. So when we get in the end the x and the logarithm of the determinant of the Jacobian of the mapping, we define the loss as the logarithm of the determinant of the Jacobian itself minus the log of the probability under a normal density, which is this quantity, and we return it. So now all this being defined, it's quite simple now. We define our model. So here for the toy example I'm going to show the input under dimension is 2, in the dimension I pick 2, depth is 4, this is arbitrary. I define a random optimizer, and I'm going to go through my samples, and every time I just compute the output on my training data, and then I compute my loss, which is the log proba defined in the previous slide, and then I do my backward pass. And now if I want to sample after the training is done, I simply define a variable which is a tensor full of Gaussian noise, and I compute the invert mapping through my mapping. So here are some examples, some results on toy examples. So here in blue, you have both the training points and the level lines of the true density. So in that case, it's just a sanity check because it's a Gaussian density. On the blue dots are the synthetic sample, and the red dots are the synthetic samples, the red lines are the level lines of the learned density. So basically what I do is that I map a circle through f minus 1, and I plot it in the plan. So we see that we retrieve properly the Gaussian density, which already was not so obvious because we have this complicated mapping in the layer. So we would imagine that this will fail, but it works pretty well. And here, if my distribution is deformed Gaussian, it works also very well. If it's this zigzag, it works very well. If it's this V, it works very well. And even this, so this is quite a complicated case where the true distribution is a Gaussian split in two and pushed away. So there is actually zero mass in the middle, and we see that the network was able to kind of split its own Gaussian into to catch the two halves. So to use this on images, it requires a bit more of work because we have to deal with convolution layers, sort of convolution layers. So Dean et al. Propose two basic things. So first, when they use the coupling layers over activation maps, they use a binary mask, which is a checkerboard, so which means that half of the components are kept unchanged and half of the components are modified, but those are alternating in a geometrical pattern. And they also consider squeezing layers where they take a convolution layer like this, an activation map like this, sorry, and they are going to multiply by 4 the number of channels, but divide by 4 by 2 each of the dimension x and y, and they stack, so they extract the component in a certain little square and they stack them through the channels, which means that they maintain the topology and they kind of concentrate the information which is in a little neighborhood over the channel, so it becomes pointwise in space and dispatched across channels. And one more thing that they do is that they alternate the binary patterns, so they also consider pass-through through the layers. So it means that some channels are at some point extracted from the initial layers and forwarded as is unchanged, which in the end allows the overall model to have some multi-scale modeling. So it can inject some noise in a very homogeneous manner or in a more structured manner by putting it considering channels which correspond to the initial layers or channels that correspond to the later layers. Technical details need to be checked in the paper because it starts to be a bit technical. So in the end, their overall structure is 2 stages, each of them composed of 3 checkboard coupling layers, a smoothing layer, and 3 channels coupling layer, and a factor out layer. And then one stage where there are 4 checkboard coupling layer and a factor out layer. The S and T mappings get more complex in the later layers. They add more capacity. So this is some of the results trained on ImageNet. So here the network is trained on ImageNet, and then they regenerate those images. So those are sampled from the trained network. So it's very, very nice. Same on the celebrity database. Same on the bedroom class of Elson. The church outdoor category of the same dataset. And then a way of checking that the network is not simply learning by heart a few examples. What they did is to pick 4 samples from each dataset, interpolate in the link space other images in between. And it's quite impressive because we see that indeed the images we produce by interpolating the latent space truly look like the images from the class. So it's very, very impressive. Okay, so that's all for today. Again, that was a pleasure. And if you have any comment, any question, do not hesitate to drop me a mail. Bye.